So this lecture will be muscles of the arm and forearm. We're going to start with the anterior arm, and in the anterior arm, everything is controlled by the musculocutaneous nerve. This is the nerve that is from the lateral cord with a branch from the middle trunk initially. So the two main muscles of the anterior arm are biceps brachii and brachialis. They are both flexors of the elbow. Some books will put coracobrachialis in with this pair, even though it doesn't move the elbow, but because the body of the muscle is in the anterior arm, so it also has this musculocutaneous nerve, which I lectured on with muscles of the shoulder. So let's start with biceps brachii. Biceps brachii means it has two heads or two origins. The origins are the long head is from the supraglenoid tubercle, which is just superior to the glenoid fossa. And what happens with that one is it goes across the top of the humerus, across the head of the humerus and down the bicipital groove. So you can think long head takes the long way to get there. The short head comes from the coracoid process and comes straight down the anterior of the arm. It's also more medial, so you can think the short head takes the short cut to get there. The insertion is on the radial tuberosity on the radius. Basically, biceps comes into this great big tendon that I've just highlighted in red and goes to the radius. So it means it crosses two joints. It crosses the shoulder joint and it crosses the elbow joint. So it will have actions at both joints. It therefore is a flexor of the shoulder and a flexor of the elbow. And because it's attached to the radius, it is a supinator of the forearm. So when we combine these movements, I want you to think about, say, starting a lawnmower where you reach out in the pronated position, and as you flex your elbow, you also supinate. Eating an apple, you reach out and you grab the apple and you supinate and flex your elbow to bring the apple towards you. So it does that sort of movement, and it is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. So it's the great big muscle of the anterior arm. The smaller muscle, but only slightly, is the brachialis. Now, when I did deltoid, I said where trapezius ends, deltoid begins. The other half of that is where deltoid ends, brachialis begins. So you can see here where I'm drawing with the red pen, that's the tip of the deltoid, and then that muscle between biceps to the anterior and triceps to the posterior is the brachialis muscle from the lateral humerus. Its origin, therefore, is the deltoid tuberosity. It's going to run deep to biceps, and it's going to insert onto the coronoid process in the ulnar tuberosity, on the ulna. Because the ulna doesn't actually move in supination, it doesn't work for that, but it is a strong flexor of the elbow. So biceps and brachialis are synergists on flexion of the elbow, but brachialis also works when the forearm is what we call semi-pronated, which means the hands turn sideways. I want you to think about reaching out and grabbing a glass sideways with your hand. Therefore, this is called the drinking muscle because it will actually keep the forearm semi-pronated where biceps would supinate and spill whatever's in your glass. And the innervation is the musculocutaneous nerve. So this is the one that works to the side. Now, brachioradialis is the third elbow flexor, but it is not in the anterior arm. Instead, it is in the sort of posterior lateral forearm. So it is origin on the supracondylar ridge, the lateral one of the humerus, so it's just inferior to brachialis. And it's going to insert on the styloid process of the radius. So if you're looking here, that would be about here, which I just circled in red, on the just before the hand on the wrist. The important thing with brachioradialis is this does not cross the wrist. Because it inserts on the radius, that's why it gets the name brachioradialis, it is only moves the elbow. Now, when it is going to flex the elbow, the hand or the forearm needs to be in the pronated position. This is the one where if you think about doing pull-ups with your hands in the pronated position, it's going to be the one that flexes the elbow. It also is going to stabilize the elbow during other movements. But because it's in the forearm, it gets the radial nerve. It's kind of on that posterior edge, is near the thumb. So therefore it gets the radial nerve instead of the musculocutaneous. So radialis, radial nerve. So that is brachioradialis. If I go up to the posterior arm, it's still the radial nerve, because if you've listened to the brachial plexus lecture, you'll remember that the radial nerve does all of the posterior arm and the posterior forearm. This is triceps brachii, which means 3 heads. And we're looking at shoulder and elbow extension. These are the antagonists to biceps and brachialis. So here is a photograph of triceps brachii. We're showing the long head and the lateral head. The medial head would be wrapped around the other side, but we have 3 heads. The long head comes from the infraglenoid tubercle, which is just inferior to the glenoid fossa. The lateral head, which comes from the lateral posterior humerus. The medial head comes from the medial posterior humerus, and they're all deep to the long head. The insertion for all of these is the olecranon process on the ulna. So if you see this big, huge tendon that's there, all these muscles are coming into, I've kind of outlined it in red. All those tendons fuse together and attach to the olecranon process, which is the point of the elbow. If you wind up, if you flex your elbow, the olecranon process is the point of your elbow, and that's where triceps attaches, triceps brachii, so that when it pulls on it, it pulls the olecranon superiorly, which extends the elbow. The long head is the only one that crosses the shoulder because it goes up to that infraglenoid tubercle. Therefore, because it crosses the shoulder, it will also extend the shoulder. And its innervation is the radial nerve because it is posterior. So there's your radial nerve right there. Let's go look at the muscles of the forearm. We're going to start with the anterior forearm. I want you to think about this photograph. The model is of a right arm. So what you're looking at is a supinated right arm with the hand facing you. The muscles of the anterior forearm are called the common flexors of the wrist and fingers. There's about 7 or 8 different little muscles in here. We're going to group them together as the common flexors. So it also includes the pair of muscles that are the pronators. So their origin is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and their insertion is the wrist and fingers, the anterior surface. So what you see are all these big, long tendons that then come into the hand. The action is to flex the wrist and the fingers, and the innervation is the median, I should have said, and the ulnar nerve, because we're not going to separate them out. The median nerve goes to the ones closer to the thumb. The ulnar nerve goes to the muscles closer to the 5th digit of the little finger. But if I ask you for what is the innervation of this group of muscles, you're going to say median and ulnar nerves. So then we look at the muscles of the posterior forearm. You can tell now we're looking at the other side. It's still the right forearm, but now you can see that the fingers kind of curl away from you. So that is how we look at this. These are the common extensors, and it does include a little muscle named supinator. So the origin here is the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. The insertion is the posterior surface of the carpals and phalanges, the wrist and fingers. You can actually see these big white tendons flowing towards the fingers. Most of the muscles that control your hand are actually in your forearm for volume. And the action is the extension of the wrist, the extension of the fingers. So think about letting go of something. You've grabbed something, now you're letting go of it. Pardon me. And that doesn't take as much muscle as grabbing it in the first place. The innervation is the radial nerve. So there's a mnemonic for the flexors and extensors origin, because you want to remember that the flexors come from the medial epicondyle and the extensors come from the lateral epicondyle. So I have this little mnemonic: flexors are medial, extensors are lateral. So you listen to FM radio. You might not listen to this anymore, but it used to be very popular. FM radio means that flexors are medial. And you do so on the L train. The L train stands for extensors are lateral. So maybe this will help you remember that flexors are medial because it's FM radio, and extensors are lateral because you do so on the L train. And that is the mnemonic for those. And that should finish the arm and forearm muscles.